Hi, this is Matt Baker. Welcome to episode 3 of Who Was Jesus Really? In this series, I'm exploring some rather far out theories about who the historical Jesus might have been. Not in order to try and convince you of any of them, but rather as a fun way to introduce a bit of the history of first century Judea. In episode 1, we explored Joseph Rehman's idea that Jesus might have been a secret grandson of Herod the Great, as well as a descendant of the Hasmoneans. Then in episode 2, we explored Lena Einhorn's hypothesis that Jesus might have been the same person who Josephus refers to as the Egyptian, an idea that, if true, would require us to shift the main events in Jesus' life about 20 years later. In the comments on that video, a few people pointed out that I didn't deal with the potential problems with the time shift theory in the same way that I had with the Herodian theory. Therefore, before I introduce today's topic, I thought I'd go ahead and do that. As many of you pointed out, the main problem with shifting the Gospel's timeline 20 years into the future is that it puts Jesus' death after the earliest Pauline epistles. Even secular historians agree that at least 7 of the New Testament books attributed to Paul are in fact genuine, with the earliest one, Galatians, usually being dated to around 48 CE. However, according to Josephus, the revolt led by the Egyptian took place in 54 CE. Therefore, if Jesus and the Egyptian were the same person, how could Paul be writing about Jesus' death 6 years earlier? Now, Lena Einhorn does in fact address this issue in her book. She points out that the bulk of Paul's ministry can actually be squeezed into a time period of just 7 years. She argues that the only thing that stretches it out to a much longer period is this passage in Galatians, in which Paul describes his conversion and then writes, "Afterwards I went into Arabia. Later I returned to Damascus. Then after 3 years I went up to Jerusalem. Then I went to Syria and Cilicia. Then after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem." Now, it's unclear as to whether that 14 years was after the 3 years or whether it was 14 years total. But either way, this triples the total length of his ministry, even though nowhere in the New Testament does it describe what he did during those 14 years, which is kind of strange. Therefore, Einhorn argues that the 14 years was actually a later addition, and that the entirety of Paul's ministry, including his 7 genuine letters, can in fact be placed after the Egyptians' revolt. But there's still a major problem because there is one particular date in Paul's life that can be pinpointed with almost 100% accuracy. You see, in Acts chapter 18, it mentions that Paul was taken to court in Corinth during the tenure of a Roman governor named Gallio. We know from Roman records when Gallio served, and therefore we can date that incident to exactly 51 CE. This definitely places Paul in Corinth before the Egyptians' revolt in Jerusalem. So, unless one argues that the Gallio reference was yet another thing that was added later, Einhorn's whole time shift theory basically falls apart. But what if we shifted Jesus' life earlier instead of later? Well, that's basically what the next theory does. The third theory we'll be looking at was developed by a retired accountant named Daniel Unterbrink, and it is presented in his book, Judas of Nazareth. In this book, Unterbrink argues that Jesus was the exact same person as the historical figure Judas of Galilee, who I mentioned last time as being the one who led the census revolt of 6 CE. However, before we dive into it, let me tell you about today's sponsor, Ground News. I've asked Ground News to sponsor all of the episodes in this series so far, because their platform does the same thing that I've been doing with the historical Jesus. You see, Ground News is a website and app that allows you to examine thousands of news topics from a variety of different angles. For every breaking story, they combine coverage from multiple sources so that you can compare reporting from across the political spectrum and the world. For example, they recently gathered over 120 articles about a report that found that most of the immigrants being deported from the US are Christians. By the way, you can follow along at home by scanning the QR code on screen or by clicking the link in the description below. Comparing headlines, sources on the left were more likely to mention Donald Trump as the one leading the deportations, whereas sources on the right were more likely to point out that many of those being deported are Catholics. So you can see why ground news is so useful. They even have useful charts. I love how their app uses charts like these ones to show additional data on each news source, such as whether they lean to one side politically and even where they get their funding from. It even highlights what isn't being widely covered on the blind spot feed. Thus, it can help you have more productive conversations with families and friends on contentious topics. So, in a world that is constantly changing, ground news is a tool that we all need. This month, you can get 40% off unlimited access to their Vantage plan, a deal that's only available if you use my link, ground.news/charts. Okay, let me now tell you about Judas of Galilee and his potential connection to Jesus. This time, I'm going to build a timeline based on Josephus. Now, in case you don't know who Josephus is, well, he was a Jewish Roman historian who lived about a generation or two after Jesus. His two main books, Antiquities of the Jews and the Jewish War, both of which were written in Greek, are the best secular sources we have for what was happening in first century Judea. So let me start by adding some of the events we talked about in the first two episodes to the timeline. In episode 1, I mentioned that Herod the Great kills his second and third-born sons, Alexander and Aristobulus, in 7 BCE, and then his firstborn son Antipater in 4 BCE. So these are the references in Josephus to these two events, as well as the dates. Take note that, for example, 16:11:7 means volume 16, chapter 11, verse 7. I also talked about how Herod dies just a few days after he kills Antipater, at which point he is succeeded by his son Archelaus. Now, in episode 2, I mentioned that Archelaus was eventually deposed in 6 CE, which is when Judea was made into a Roman province to be ruled by governors instead. This lasted until 41 CE, which is when the Herodian monarchy was briefly restored, with Herod the Great's grandson Agrippa being made king. But Agrippa died after just 3 years from being poisoned, an event that's actually recorded in the Bible as well. Last time I gave the wrong reference for that. It's actually Acts chapter 12, verses 21 to 23. After this, Judea went back to having Roman governors, and it was during this period that the Egyptian appeared. He's the person who was the focus of episode 2. But in this episode, I want to go back to 6 CE. Remember, the first thing that the Romans did when they took over Judea was conduct a census so that they could figure out how much tax revenue they could get. Josephus mentions that census here, and in fact, the Bible mentions it as well. The person in charge of that census was Quirinius, who was the governor of the next-door province of Syria. As I mentioned last time, this led to a major rebellion, led by the man who is the focus of this episode, Judas of Galilee. But according to Daniel Unterbrink, this is not when Judas's story begins. You see, it's possible that Judas of Galilee's involvement in acts of rebellion actually started much earlier. If we go back to 4 BCE, right around the time of Herod the Great's death, we get these references in Josephus. I'll read you the one from Antiquities. There was one Judas, the son of Seraphius. Note that this was an alternate spelling of Sepphoris, which was a major town in Galilee, and Matthias, the son of Margalothus, 2 of the most eloquent men among the Jews, and the most celebrated interpreters of Jewish laws, and men well beloved by the people. Now, it's not clear whether or not this Judas is the same Judas who later led the census revolt, but there's good reason to assume that they are. Not only are they both named Judas, they are both from Galilee, are both teachers of the law, are both popular with the people, and are both involved in similar acts of rebellion. Josephus goes on to write, the king, meaning Herod the Great, had erected over the great gate of the temple a large golden eagle of great value. Now, the law forbids those that propose to live according to it to erect images or representations of any living creature. So these wise men, meaning Judas and Matthias, persuaded their followers to pull down the golden eagle. So in the very middle of the day, they got upon the place, they pulled down the eagle, and cut it into pieces with axes. Now, what do you think Herod thought of these actions? Well, he of course was enraged and had both Judas and Matthias arrested. Interestingly though, Josephus mentions Matthias being put to death, but not Judas. This may have been because Herod died shortly thereafter. Also interesting is the fact that, according to Josephus, one of the first things that Archelaus does, as the new ruler, is release his father's prisoners at the request of the people. So it's possible that Judas was set free at this point, an event quite similar to the one where Pilate releases Barabbas. Josephus then mentions a rebel named Judas again, here, this time in connection to an event that takes place in Syawish, Galilee, in which Judas and a bunch of rebels steal weapons from the royal palace. Again, this may or may not be the same Judas, but it is quite likely, especially considering the repeated mention of Syawish. Interestingly, yet again, there's no mention of Judas being killed, which means that he was still alive to lead the census revolt in 6 CE, which is the main event that Judas of Galilee is associated with. Now, even though that revolt was put down, Josephus considers it to be a major turning point in Judean history because it birthed what he calls the fourth philosophy, the other three being the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. The followers of this fourth philosophy would go on to become known as the Zealots and or the Sicarii, terms that, as I mentioned last time, also come up in connection to Jesus. About 2 generations after Judas of Galilee, it would be the Zealots who would fight against the Romans in the First Jewish-Roman War, which of course is the main topic of Josephus's book, The Jewish War. As you probably know, the Jews lost that war, resulting in the complete destruction of Jerusalem and its temple. That, in turn, played a major role in the growth of Christianity. Now, not only was Judas of Galilee the founder of the fourth philosophy, aka the Zealots, it was his sons and grandsons who continued on as the leaders of the movement. For example, here, Josephus mentions Judas's sons, James and Simon, who led a revolt in the 40s. That was quashed by the Roman governor at the time, Tiberius Alexander. Then, at the very start of the war in 66 CE, Menahem, who Josephus calls Judas's son, but was more likely his grandson, was able to break into the fortress of Masada, where he stole weapons. Sound familiar? Which then allowed him to capture Jerusalem. At this point, Menahem started to behave like a king, which angered other zealots because the whole point of the rebellion was to get rid of tyrants, not to appoint a new one. Thus, Menahem ended up being killed by his own cousin, Eliezer. It was Eliezer, probably another grandson of Judas of Galilee, who ended up being the leader of the last Jewish holdouts at Masada, the ones who supposedly committed mass suicide rather than be defeated. I say supposedly because there's actually some debate about what actually happened at Masada and whether or not the rebels there should be thought of as heroes. Now, I tell you all of this history to drive home just how important Judas of Galilee is in terms of the overall history of first century Judea, and therefore how he might have become a powerful symbol in the minds of Jews at the time. But there's something puzzling about Josephus's coverage of Judas and his family. Josephus goes out of his way to clearly mention the deaths of 4 of Judas's descendants, James, Simon, Menahem, and Eliezer, but he does not mention the death of Judas himself, which is strange because Josephus obviously sees Judas of Galilee and the fourth philosophy as a central thread in the story he's telling. And this is one of the reasons why Daniel Unterbrink thinks that Jesus and Judas might have been the same person. Josephus, after discussing the census revolt and the 4 main sects of Judaism, says very little about anything that happened during the next 20 years. The first Judean governor that he talks about at length is Pontius Pilate, who he says angered the Jews by putting up images of Caesar and using temple funds to build an aqueduct. It is right after this that we get the most famous paragraph in the entire works of Josephus, the one that mentions Jesus. Now, according to most scholars, the original passage was likely altered by later Christian scribes, but the consensus is that at least some of the passage was in fact written by Josephus. Here's what the original might have looked like. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, for he was one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. And when, upon accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had condemned him to a cross, those who had first come to love him did not cease. Now, it's not hard to imagine that if Judas of Galilee was still alive, he probably would have objected to Pilate putting up images of Caesar, like he did when Herod put up the golden eagle. And it's not hard to imagine that this might have got him into trouble yet again. The mention of Jesus in the flow of Josephus's narrative seems abrupt and out of place, but it would fit very nicely if it was actually a record of Judas of Galilee's death. You see, maybe the original passage read, "About this time there still lived Judas, a wise man." That would fit much better. Remember, Josephus has already referred to Judas as a wise man, a term that he uses very sparingly. The name Jesus could also have been Judas's nickname. After all, Jesus simply means God's Savior, and it's not hard to imagine a famous teacher revolutionary like Judas of Galilee being thought of as the nation's savior. But it's not just the placement of Jesus within Josephus's narrative that makes Unterbrink put forward the idea that Jesus and Judas might have been the same person. In his book, he lists 42 similarities between the two men. To be honest, I find some of them to be a bit of a stretch, but let me highlight a few that do stand out. First, there's the obvious one, the fact that both men are from Galilee. Specifically, Jesus is said to have come from Nazareth. And where is Nazareth? Well, it's right next to the much larger city of Syawish. Then there's the fact that there are a lot of similarities in what they taught. Both the fourth philosophy as well as the early Christian movement put an emphasis on the sharing of wealth and on not just following the letter of the law, but on understanding its deeper meaning, which involved things like helping the poor and fighting for justice. Both Judas and Jesus also opposed the paying of taxes. While most people just remember the "render unto Caesar what is Caesar's" verse, the Bible also states in Luke 23 verse 2 that one of the reasons why Jesus was arrested was for opposing the tax. There's also lots of little stuff, like the fact that Judas had two sons named James and Simon, and Jesus had two brothers named James and Simon. Judas had followers called Zealots, and Jesus had followers called Zealots. Now, some of the arguments that Unterbrink uses are actually based on a different version of Josephus, known as the Slavonic Josephus. I haven't used any of these references so far. The Slavonic Josephus is based on a manuscript that dates to 1463, which was likely based on a translation of Josephus made a few centuries earlier in Kievan Rus. The thing is, it's quite a bit different from the standard Josephus, with lots of stuff omitted and some other stuff added. So it's unclear whether the Slavonic Josephus represents something closer to the original or whether it's a later Christian creation. Most scholars lean toward it being not authentic, whereas Unterbrink leans toward it being authentic. One of his arguments is based on the placement of John the Baptist in the Slavonic Josephus. The standard Josephus places John the Baptist here, close to the mention of Jesus, whereas the Slavonic Josephus places him here, right before Judas of Galilee and the census revolt. That seems like a strange thing for a Christian scribe to do on purpose, because it contradicts the biblical account. Unterbrink therefore argues that this is in fact the original version, and that therefore John the Baptist is quite clearly linked to Judas of Galilee. He also points out that the Slavonic Josephus includes a story about the Star of Bethlehem, very similar to the Gospel version, but it places it much earlier, more than 20 years before when the Gospels say Jesus was born, but in what would likely be around the time when Judas of Galilee was born. Which brings me to the question of why then did the gospel writers instead place Jesus' birth either around the time of Herod's death or around the time of the census revolt? Well, according to Unterbrink's theory, it's because these are the two main starting points for Judas of Galilee. The first being when he helped tear down the golden eagle, and the second being when he led the census revolt. In other words, these are symbolic births, not literal ones. Now, I think the greatest weakness in Unterbrink's book is that he makes too many assumptions, such as linking all of Josephus's Judases together, when Judas was one of the most popular names at the time, as well as his reliance on the Slavonic Josephus, which most scholars don't accept as being genuine. But one thing that I do really like about Unterbrink's book is that he shows, in a step-by-step fashion, how a historical Jewish movement, led by an ordinary man, might have eventually evolved into the religion we now know as Christianity. In other words, even if Judas of Galilee wasn't Jesus, the standard secular view is that some first-century character was, and that character eventually morphed into the Jesus of the New Testament, based on how his followers viewed him after his death. Here's how Unterbrink explains it. Originally, there was some sort of very Jewish movement around a guy called Jesus. It was very Jewish in the sense that it was mostly made up of Jews, and it still promoted following Jewish laws, such as circumcision and the kosher rules. You can still see traces of this original movement in how the New Testament portrays James and Peter. But then, at some point, Paul arrives on the scene, and Paul starts focusing more on gaining Gentile converts. This involves dropping the adherence to Jewish laws, and instead universalizing and spiritualizing the message, so that Jesus is now seen as the Messiah of all mankind. Paul doesn't write the four Gospels, but he has a strong influence over those that did. Then, following the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, Paul's movement suddenly makes more sense than the original one. The Gospels get written, turning Jesus into more of a legend, and eventually the movement evolves into what we know today as Christianity. So that's theory number 3. One advantage it has over theory number 2 is that Judas of Galilee has more time to morph into Jesus, whereas the Egyptian does not. As usual, let me know what you think of this theory on a scale of 1 to 10. And if you know any other theories you'd like me to cover, feel free to suggest them in the comments. Thanks for watching.